They said her name only once, Eliza. Then the ledger swallowed it whole. A single line in ink. Sold, female, with children, separated. That was all the archive preserved. But behind that entry lay a sound that still echoes through the walls of New Orleans. The sound of a mother's scream that no historian could erase. The year was 1842, and the slave market on Chartres Street was alive with the stench of commerce, the trading of human lives under the perfume of magnolia and blood. The pen was crowded that morning, packed with flesh polished to shine, children rubbed in oil like merchandise. The air was thick, damp and sweet with decay. And in that choking silence before the auction began, a woman clung to her 2 children and whispered the only thing she had left. Hope. Eliza was not born into this fate. She had once been property in a wealthy household where she was taught to read fragments of scripture to her master's daughter. Her tongue carried grace, her face intelligence. But the system had no room for dignity. It rewarded obedience and erased humanity. When her master fell into debt, his human assets were seized. The creditors came not for silver or land, but for Eliza and her children. Within a week, they were chained together and sent south to the boiling heart of the trade, New Orleans. The city that called itself civilized yet pulsed with ritual cruelty. The building looked ordinary, brick, no windows open to the street, but it was the belly of America's most refined horror. A holding pen where souls were priced and futures dismantled. Men were ordered to flex their muscles, women were told to smile, children were told to be quiet. And there, under the slow turn of ceiling fans and the watchful eyes of traders, Eliza stood with her daughter and her son, waiting to be catalogued. The overseer's voice was cold, measured, almost professional. Wash them down, oil the skin, straighten the hair, dress them clean. He spoke like a man preparing artifacts for display, not living beings for sale. Eliza obeyed in silence. Her body trembled not from fear of punishment, but from the premonition that something sacred was about to be broken. Her children, unaware of the full meaning of the day, pressed against her dress. The boy clutched her leg. The girl, with delicate fingers, brushed her mother's tears and whispered, "Don't cry, Mama." When the auctioneer entered, the room stilled. His cane struck the floor once. He was a man who turned suffering into theater. His voice carried authority sharpened by greed. He began the introductions with a salesman's rhythm, strong backs, good teeth, loyal temperaments. Then his eyes found Eliza. He paused. "Here," he said, "is a woman of refinement, educated, graceful, excellent in service, with 2 healthy children." The crowd stirred. A mother, they thought, could be profitable. Her offspring could be trained for labor or pleasure. But there was a problem. Affection. A mother's bond was a flaw in the system. Love complicated ownership. When Eliza realized they meant to separate her from her children, something inside her broke in silence first. A trembling under the ribs. A sharpness behind the eyes. Then it erupted. She fell to her knees, her arms locking around her children like a fortress. "Please," she whispered at first. "Don't part me from my children." The room hesitated. For a heartbeat, the illusion of civility cracked. The buyers avoided her gaze. Even the auctioneer's hand trembled before tightening on his cane. But commerce resumed. The bids began. The merchant wanted the girl, the planter wanted the mother, the boy would go cheap. The numbers rose like vultures circling a corpse. Eliza's voice grew raw, pleas becoming screams, screams dissolving into sobs. Witnesses would later recall that her cries shook the walls, that even seasoned traders turned their faces away. But the ledger didn't record tears. It only recorded value. When her daughter was pulled from her arms, Eliza's scream tore through the air like something supernatural, a sound that didn't belong to this world. It wasn't just grief, it was a rupture in the fabric of humanity itself. Her voice was a weapon, and for a moment it made the powerful flinch. One guard swore he heard his mother's voice in her cry. Another dropped his pen, unable to steady his hand. Yet the sale continued. The hammer fell, and Eliza was left kneeling on the floor, her hands empty, her body shaking in a pool of oil and saltwater tears. That moment, her scream did not end in that room. It reverberated through time, carried in the memory of a man named Solomon Northup, a free man kidnapped into slavery, who witnessed it and later wrote it down. Without him, she would have vanished completely. But the truth is deeper. Eliza's story was not unique. It was a symptom of a machine built on psychological control, an institution that learned to destroy the sacred bond between mother and child because love was rebellion. Think about that. To maintain power, they had to erase love itself. They didn't just own bodies, they engineered obedience. They tore families apart, not only to prevent escape, but to rewrite emotion into economics. It was institutional mind control before the term existed. The plantation was not just a field, it was a laboratory for manipulating the human spirit. Eliza's story is a keyhole through which we glimpse the real horror, the calculated design of control. They understood something chilling, that to dominate a people, you must first break the archetype of the mother, the one who nurtures, protects, and gives meaning to life. If she can be broken, all others fall in line. Every empire that mastered psychological domination has repeated that pattern, from Rome to the colonizers to modern systems we mistake for freedom. When you hear Eliza's scream, know this. It was not just grief. It was prophecy. It was the sound of resistance buried beneath commerce, the sound of the human spirit refusing to die even as its body was sold. That sound did not end in 1842. It echoes in every institution that teaches compliance over truth, in every system that profits from obedience. Her cry was not just for her children, it was for us. And if you've heard it, if something inside you stirs uncomfortably when you imagine her voice, then understand, you are already part of her legacy. Because the real horror of Eliza's story is not that it happened once. It's that the system that allowed it never truly ended, it just changed its language. The screams faded long ago, but the system that created them never did. It merely changed its shape, its dress, and its name. When the auctioneer's hammer fell and Eliza's body collapsed against the wooden floor, a ritual older than America had completed itself. The separation of the mother from the child, the sacred thread severed for profit, was not an accident of cruelty. It was a mechanism of control. What was done to Eliza that day was not just a sale. It was the deliberate fragmentation of identity. The destruction of her motherhood was not personal. It was political. They understood something horrifying about human nature. That if you can make a person watch their child disappear, you can make them obey anything. The plantation owners, merchants, and traders of New Orleans were not merely businessmen. They were engineers of obedience. They didn't just enslave bodies, they reprogrammed souls. Every scream in that pen was part of a larger experiment in domination, a system that studied fear as if it were a science. The ledger was their scripture, the auction block, their altar. And Eliza, she was the sacrifice. But here's what most never see. The plantation economy was only the surface. Beneath it pulsed a deeper machinery, a network of financiers, insurers, and legislators who turned flesh into capital. The same banks that built cathedrals of marble on Wall Street insured the lives of slaves as movable property. The same families whose descendants now control foundations and universities once traded children like cattle and called it progress. And Eliza, she became a data point. Collateral for loans, evidence of productivity, a number on parchment inked in blood. The true cruelty was not in the whip, it was in the mathematics. The ledger stripped away humanity with precision, converting pain into arithmetic. A woman's tears became credit, a child's scream became interest. Every loss was profit somewhere else. Every broken heart was a balance restored in a banker's book. Eliza was no longer Eliza. She was a yield, a return on investment, a body to be measured, insured, and replaced. And when her daughter was pulled from her arms, it wasn't one man's evil, it was the entire architecture of empire working as designed. Understand this, slavery was not sustained by hate, it was sustained by order. It was an early manifestation of psychological control perfected through bureaucracy. The cruelty was ritualized, professionalized, justified by law, and sanctified by scripture. The system's genius was not its violence, it was its logic. It made oppression seem rational. It made horror feel like routine. This is how every institution of control operates then and now. They do not ask you to see evil, they ask you to see necessity. Eliza's scream was inconvenient not because it was emotional, but because it disrupted the illusion. The plantation thrived on silence, on predictability, on compliance. Her outcry was a fracture in the hypnosis of civilization. It forced witnesses to remember that the system was not abstract. It was a living wound. The archives tried to bury her. They wrote her name once, then erased her story in ink thinner than memory. Historians mention her in passing as a mother whose children were sold away. But if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice between the lines, not in words, but in the pulse of history itself. Because Eliza is not just a woman from 1842, she is the archetype of every human being broken by a machine designed to extract obedience. And here's where the descent begins. Because the same mechanism that controlled Eliza still controls you. Refined, invisible, efficient. Look around you. The plantation became the factory became the corporation, the overseer became the manager, the ledger became the algorithm. The same cold arithmetic governs it all: time, profit, productivity, control. The modern man doesn't hear the whip. He hears the hum of the fluorescent light, the ping of the email, the vibration of the phone reminding him he's late. Different tools, same leash. The old slave pens of New Orleans had chains made of iron. The new ones have chains made of expectation. You think you're free because you can vote, speak, consume. But your labor, your time, your silence, all are still commodities in a system that thrives on obedience. You were trained, just like Eliza, to perform, to smile, to endure, to comply. Her auction was public. Yours is invisible. When Eliza's master told her to smile before the buyers, she obeyed through tears. She thought compliance might save her children. You obey because you believe compliance will save your stability, your comfort, your image. But the truth is older and darker. Systems of control never reward obedience. They feed on it. Eliza's tears bought profit for someone else. Your exhaustion does the same. The plantation was the blueprint. The experiment succeeded. Humanity learned how to build machines that harvest energy from suffering and call it civilization. But in every age, there is a moment when one person sees through it, when the mask slips, when a scream pierces the polite silence. Eliza's scream was that moment, and it terrified those who heard it because it exposed the lie of their morality. They could no longer pretend they were good men conducting business. Her voice made them see the monsters they'd become. Ask yourself, how many systems today rely on the same blindness? How many institutions survive because good men refuse to hear the screams beneath the profit? Eliza's story is not about slavery. It's about conditioning. It's about how easily people accept control when it comes dressed as necessity. The plantation is gone, but the psychology remains. Every man who kneels to comfort instead of truth. Every worker who obeys instead of questions. Every citizen who complies instead of confronts, walks in the shadow of that auction pen. You are not separate from Eliza's world. You are its descendant. And the proof is this. Even now, her scream makes you uneasy, because deep down, you recognize it. It's the sound of something you've buried, the part of you that remembers what freedom feels like. Before we continue deeper, pause for a moment. If you can feel what I'm saying, if you understand the connection, type this phrase twice in the comments to anchor it into your awareness. I will not be owned. Once you write it, you break the first chain. The men who witnessed Eliza's breakdown that day did not realize what they were seeing. To them, it was another sale gone inconveniently emotional, a disruption in a clean, profitable process. But what truly happened in that auction room was spear. Ital insurrection. For a few minutes, the veil between human and inhuman lifted. The machinery of commerce, polished and rational, met the raw, unfiltered resistance of the soul, and the world recoiled. Eliza's cries did not end with her voice. They entered the minds of the men who heard them. Some claimed they couldn't sleep for days, haunted by the sound of her plea echoing in their skulls. Others hardened themselves, convincing their conscience that it was the way things were. That's how all systems survive, by giving men just enough justification to numb their empathy. They tell themselves they're not villains, only participants. But participation is the quietest form of evil. And this is the forbidden truth. The structure of power doesn't need monsters, it needs functionaries, men who obey, men who don't ask questions, men who perform their part efficiently, convinced that morality is someone else's job. That's how plantations worked. That's how empires worked. That's how every institution of control still works today. Eliza's body was enslaved, but her scream pierced the architecture of obedience. It wasn't just pain, it was data corruption. It disrupted the pattern. It forced men to remember that the inventory they handled had souls that could defy command. That scream was the one sound a control system can never fully contain. Truth. And truth terrifies the powerful, because it has a frequency that bypasses logic and lodges directly into the nervous system. It awakens memory, ancestral, ancient, inconvenient memory. It reminds the human being what it means to be alive, not owned. That's why every age of tyranny silences its prophets, censors its thinkers, and erases its records. The danger isn't the rebel with a weapon, it's the one with a voice that cuts through illusion. That's what Eliza was, even if she didn't know it, a prophet of pain. Her scream became part of the atmospheric record of the human spirit. You can't find it in history books, but it exists in the spaces between them, in the way the walls of old buildings in New Orleans still feel heavy, the way the air carries something unsaid. You can feel it if you stand still enough. That low hum of sorrow is not gone. It's coded into the DNA of a nation that built its wealth on the destruction of the maternal bond. You see, Eliza's story isn't only about race. It's about architecture, the architecture of obedience, the psychological formula that turns human beings into instruments. You destroy the maternal bond, and you erase the concept of unconditional love. You erase that, and you weaken the instinct to protect. When protection dies, control begins. The men who bought and sold Eliza's children didn't see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as maintaining order. That phrase still echoes today, doesn't it? You hear it in boardrooms, in political chambers, in classrooms, in headlines. Maintain order. It sounds noble, rational, civilized, but in truth it is the voice of the overseer, the voice of the auctioneer. The same voice that told Eliza to smile. They always ask you to smile before they take everything from you. The same technique of domination was exported across generations. The breaking of family bonds became cultural policy, educational systems, social engineering. They learned to manipulate identity so completely that people would discipline themselves, no whips required. The plantation evolved into the invisible infrastructure of control you live inside today. You clock in, you produce, you comply. You tell yourself it's freedom because no one's holding a chain. But look closer. You still trade hours of your life for survival. You still measure your worth in productivity. You still apologize for needing rest. You still perform smiles for systems that exploit your energy and call it progress. That is plantation logic, civilized, modern, digitized. And while the walls are cleaner now, the hierarchy is the same. The few own the many. The many obey for the illusion of stability. Eliza's buyers sat in top hats, today's wear suits. Her price was in dollars, yours is in data. But Eliza's resistance lives. It lives every time a man refuses to kneel to systems that strip his spirit. Every time someone questions the logic of obedience. Every time someone chooses truth over comfort. Because you cannot kill the archetype of the mother, you can only suppress it. The feminine principle, the protector, the nurturer, that force is what control systems fear most. It is love turned into rebellion, and this is why her story matters, because the silence after her scream is the silence you live in now. The collective hypnosis that tells you to endure quietly, to accept systems of control as normal, to believe that civilization requires submission. But civilization built on subjugation is not progress. It's just a plantation with better lighting. Eliza's scream was the sound of an unowned soul reminding the world that the body may bow, but the spirit will not. And that sound, it travels. It's there in every movement that dares to expose corruption. In every whistleblower who risks everything to tell the truth. In every protest where people chant not for vengeance but for recognition. And yet, history repeats because humanity forgets. Forgetfulness is the easiest form of slavery. Every empire relies on it. Every manipulator of minds counts on it. They erase the names, bury the evidence, rewrite the narrative until you believe suffering was isolated, accidental. They make you participate willingly in your own containment. That's the evolution of control. The plantation was raw power. The modern world is refined manipulation. Eliza's overseers used fear. Your overseers use comfort. They no longer need to break you. They just need to entertain you. To keep you scrolling, buying, working, desiring, chasing. To keep you busy enough to forget the sound of that scream. But the bloodline of awareness runs deep. Every man who's ever looked around and thought, something is wrong with this world, is hearing Eliza's echo. Every woman who's ever refused to bow to a system designed to erase her strength is carrying Eliza's flame. Every time someone tells the truth knowing it will cost them, that's Eliza speaking again through time. She is not a ghost. She's the memory of freedom itself. And freedom, real freedom, always begins with remembering what was taken from you. The men who bought her believed they owned her, but they never owned the part of her that screamed, and that scream is the same sound that tears through every false structure before it falls, the sound of truth confronting illusion. You see, civilizations are not destroyed by rebellion. They are destroyed by the truths they refuse to face. The Roman Empire fell not because of invasion, but because its lies became heavier than its walls. The plantation system rotted from within, devoured by its own corruption. Every modern institution that thrives on human compliance will end the same way, when the collective memory it tried to suppress comes roaring back to life. Eliza's story was dangerous because it showed the real cost of control, that to maintain power, men must first destroy their own humanity, and that the first victim of every empire is always empathy. Her buyers didn't just purchase her body, they purchased their own decay, because the moment you treat another human being as property, you become property yourself. The overseer was not free, the master was not free. They were bound by fear, greed, and the constant paranoia that their illusion of control could crumble. And deep down, they knew it would. That's the secret history no one teaches you. Control consumes the controller. Every system built on domination becomes haunted by the souls it crushed. Every empire that silences truth eventually drowns in its own echo. Eliza's cry was not a plea, it was prophecy. It foretold what every tyrant refuses to hear, that no structure of lies can outlast the human spirit. And now, more than a century later, her voice is finding you. It has crossed time, carried in hidden books, whispered through descendants, embedded in the quiet spaces between official histories. It has waited for someone who would not flinch. Because if you've listened this far, you are not here for entertainment. You are here because something in you has begun to awaken. The part of you that knows the world you live in is not built for truth but for obedience, and that part of you is remembering. That's what makes this dangerous, because once a man remembers, once he truly remembers, he cannot be controlled. You can feel it, can't you? That quiet pulse running through these words, something ancient, something you can't quite name. It's not just history you're hearing, it's recognition. The reason Eliza's story feels like it's breathing through you right now is because the same structure that enslaved her still wants your silence, and deep down, some part of you knows it. But Eliza's story, what they tried to hide, proves that domination is systematic, and it continues wherever memory fades. So when you hear her name, don't think of a tragedy. Think of a signal, a frequency of defiance buried beneath centuries of silence. She wasn't just one woman. She was a mirror, a reflection of how far power will go to maintain control and how deeply the human spirit resists even when stripped of everything. And if you're listening closely right now, you can feel the weight of that inheritance. The same mechanism that took her children now takes your time. The same logic that priced her body now prices your attention. The same silence that followed her scream is the silence that keeps you compliant. But the moment you recognize it, the very instant you see it, the spell begins to break. That is why they erased her story, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too dangerous to remember. The question is, what happens when men remember again? There's a reason Eliza's story almost vanished from history. Power doesn't fear weapons, it fears memory, because memory cannot be controlled. Once it awakens, it spreads like fire, consuming the narratives that keep people asleep. That's why every empire rewrites its past. That's why every government, every corporation, every institution that survives on obedience must control what you remember and what you forget. Eliza's name was meant to be erased because she represented something uncontrollable. Emotional truth. The kind that doesn't need permission to exist. The kind that exposes lies with one sound. And the men who ran that auction understood that her scream, if remembered, would outlive their profits. So they buried her under silence. They folded her name between ledgers, burned testimonies, and archived her pain as disruption. They turned her into a footnote so the machine could keep moving, and, for a while, it worked. But there's a strange thing about truth. It decays slower than power. You can suppress it, edit it, censor it, but you cannot kill it. It waits, buried under dust and ink, until someone with eyes unclouded finds it again. And every time it returns, it does so stronger, because the world that tried to erase it has grown softer, more fragile, more ripe for collapse. Eliza's scream is the kind of truth that doesn't stay dead. It lives in vibration, in the muscles of the descendants of those who endured, and in the guilt of those who benefited. It lives in the atmosphere of every city built on human suffering. Walk through New Orleans today and you can feel it, the heaviness that clings to the air, the quiet between footsteps on cobblestone streets where once stood pens of flesh and bone. But this is not just a ghost story, it's a warning, because the same structure that buried her still buries truth today. The plantation became the corporation, the overseer became the algorithm, the whip became the debt, the ledger became the contract you sign without reading. The silence that followed Eliza's scream became the polite language of compliance and policy, procedure. You think you live in a different world, you don't. You live inside the perfected version of hers. In 1842, Eliza's humanity was reduced to a commodity. Today, your attention is the commodity. Her children were taken and sold to increase profit. Today, your data, your privacy, your time are divided, packaged, sold to unseen buyers who know more about you than your family ever will. You were taught to call it convenience, but the machine hasn't changed. Only its sophistication has. You no longer have chains on your wrists. You have chains on your mind, and they are lighter, subtler, harder to see, because they don't confine your body, they guide your choices. When Eliza's body was dragged from the floor, when her screams collapsed into hoarse gasps that no one recorded, the system moved on, efficient, mechanical, merciless. That was the genius of it. The machine of power never paused for grief. It was designed to absorb pain, repurpose it, and sell the residue as progress. And that's exactly how control survives. It metabolizes the suffering it creates. Every era refines this process. The plantation became industry. Industry became information. Information became illusion. The men who owned bodies learned to own minds. They stopped needing whips when they discovered words, and the most powerful of those words was normal. That word has done more damage to humanity than any weapon ever forged. Normal is the lie that makes horror invisible. Eliza's world was made normal by the same illusion that keeps you quiet today, the belief that the system is too big to fight, too complex to escape, too civilized to be evil. But the truth is brutal. Civilization is often just organized cruelty with better branding. The men who tore Eliza's children from her arms believed they were doing nothing unusual. They ate dinner that night. They kissed their wives. They read the newspaper. They prayed to God. Because evil doesn't feel evil when it's legal, profitable, and shared. That's what makes it so deadly. It hides behind procedure, policy, hierarchy, faith. It wears the face of reason. It makes monsters look like administrators. And the same psychology lives on. Today, Men sign digital contracts that bind them to endless debt, then call it opportunity. Workers surrender their hours to corporations that drain their spirit, then call it ambition. Citizens watch injustice broadcast live, then scroll past it for comfort. The mechanisms of control don't need to hide, they just need you distracted. That's how a man becomes a slave without chains. You convince him that obedience is survival. You train him to fear freedom. That's what Eliza's overseers understood, and what every modern power structure continues to exploit. You don't need to imprison people if you can imprison their perception. And perception is the true battlefield now. When Eliza's children were sold, their physical separation was a prototype for something far more sophisticated, the separation of self. The new system doesn't divide families, it divides identities. It fractures your attention, scatters your focus, and breaks your sense of continuity. You wake up every day more divided, more manageable, more compliant. The plantation didn't die, it digitized. Do you see it yet? The same mathematics that valued Eliza's tears now values your data. Every click, every emotion, every thought, recorded, categorized, traded. The same structure that reduced her to an object now reduces you to a metric. You are measured not in humanity but in engagement. And the great deception is that you volunteered. They don't need chains because you hold the leash yourself, your device, your comfort, your reputation. The master has become invisible because the slave has become self-policing. That's the highest form of control, when you enforce your own captivity, when you censor your thoughts to fit what's acceptable, when you hesitate to speak truth because it might cost you belonging, when you consume distraction to drown the unease of your own knowing. You think Eliza's scream was about slavery, but it was about awakening. It was about that moment when a human being sees the illusion for what it is and refuses to act along with it. Her cry wasn't just grief, it was rebellion in its purest form, the refusal to consent. And that's what they fear most in you, that you'll stop consenting, that you'll stop apologizing for wanting something real, that you'll stop performing for a system that feeds on your compliance. Eliza's body was broken, but her spirit remained untamed. Her scream outlived the auctioneer, the buyers, the ledgers, the walls. It seeped into the foundation of America itself, where every institution built on profit over people still trembles beneath it. You can hear that tremor today, in every scandal, every protest, every leak of truth they tried to contain. History repeats not because we forget, but because we refuse to remember correctly. We think the story ended when the chains were broken. It didn't. It simply evolved into something more acceptable, more polite, more efficient. Freedom was never granted. It was rebranded. You think you are free because you can choose. But all your choices are within boundaries designed by someone else. Eliza's boundaries were physical, yours are psychological. She was sold in a pen, you are sold in an ecosystem, and both are invisible until you stop calling them normal. When Eliza's captors finally dragged her away, she stopped struggling, not because she surrendered, but because she saw the truth. The real prison wasn't the room, it was the belief that the room was all there was, and once you see the bars, you can no longer unsee them. So ask yourself, right now, as you listen, what are the bars you've accepted as reality? What parts of your life feel unchangeable only because someone taught you to stop questioning them? That's how history hides, in your habits, in your silence, in your comfort. But Eliza's echo doesn't leave you comfortable. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to awaken the part of you that refuses to be owned, the part that remembers went. At power fears most. The human spirit, unconditioned, untrained, untamed. That's the inheritance they tried to erase. That's the legacy they couldn't kill. And if you felt that unease rising while listening, the pull between your obedience and your truth, then understand, you've already begun to awaken. You've already stepped outside the plantation, the rest of the world just hasn't noticed yet. Eliza's voice didn't end with her breath. It became something else. An underground current of knowing that runs through every generation that follows. It waits for quiet men in loud worlds, for sleepless minds that sense there's something deeply wrong behind the mask of normalcy. You've felt it, haven't you? That faint vibration under the noise, that haunting pull that whispers you were meant for more than this. That's her voice. That's the echo of the unbroken. When power cannot destroy the truth, it buries it in noise. The plantation did this with hymns. songs of false comfort sung to drown the memory of freedom. The modern world does it with content, endless stimulation to bury the silence where truth could rise. You live inside a digital plantation where the overseers don't crack whips, they design notifications. Where your fear of missing out replaces your fear of punishment. Where you volunteer your own attention, the most sacred currency a human being possesses. Eliza's world trained bodies, yours trains minds. And both systems share the same secret law. Keep them afraid of silence, because silence is dangerous. Silence is where a man begins to see, and once he sees, he can't be controlled. That's why they keep you scrolling. That's why every screen, every feed, every advertisement is engineered to keep your nervous system humming at the edge of anxiety. They don't want you still. They don't want you thinking. They don't want you remembering that deep within you, under every layer of conditioning, there's something ancient, something untamed, that does not kneel. Eliza carried that something. It's what made her scream echo through centuries. It's what made even hardened men tremble, though they didn't know why. Because when a human being remembers what they are, all hierarchies begin to shake. And this is what makes her story forbidden knowledge. She exposed the formula of control that has never changed. The formula is simple. Step 1, isolate the individual. Step 2, exhaust them until they accept comfort over freedom. Step 3, give them small choices that look like independence but serve the same master. Step 4, convince them the master doesn't exist. That's what they did to her. That's what they do to you. When Eliza was forced to smile on command before the buyers, she became a mirror of the modern worker, performing calm while the soul fractures inside. The same false smile, the same obedience disguised as professionalism, the same suppression of outrage because outrage is unacceptable. But Eliza's scream broke the performance. That's why they feared her. She shattered the illusion that submission is strength. The system doesn't fear rebellion, it fears awareness. Because rebellion can be crushed, awareness spreads like contagion. You see, her cry was never meant to be political. It was metaphysical. It tore through the collective lie that says some humans are meant to serve while others are meant to rule. And that lie didn't vanish with slavery. It became the operating system of the modern world. Look around. Hierarchy is everywhere. In corporations, in governments, in faiths, in media. And every one of them whispers the same command. Trust authority. Distrust yourself. That's the plantation's voice. That's the overseer in modern clothing. You were born into a world that trained you to look outward for permission, to authority for answers, to systems for safety, to approval for identity. And that's how you were made manageable. Because a man who doesn't trust his own perception can be made to believe anything. That's how they sold Eliza's daughter while calling it order. That's how they sell you illusions while calling it progress. And if you think this is just history, consider this. The same insurance companies that once underwrote slave ships now insure multinational empires. The same banks that financed plantations now finance wars. The same legal codes that declared Eliza's children property evolved into corporate personhood. The system didn't die, it learned. It adapted. It refined its morality to appear cleaner, but its logic remains the same. Some lives exist to be used. And every time you trade authenticity for security, every time you silence truth for approval, you play the same role those buyers played, except now the currency is psychological. That's what makes this story terrifying. Because it's not about what they did to her, it's about what they're still doing to us. Eliza's scream was never answered because answering it would mean dismantling everything built on it. The wealth, the order, the hierarchy, all would crumble. So the world learned to live with the silence, to normalize the wound, the same way you've learned to live with your own quiet despair. That's how generational control works. It doesn't need your belief, only your participation. And yet, there's always one moment, one point of rupture when participation stops. When a man looks at the structure and feels, not fear but disgust. When the silence breaks and the scream returns. That moment is awakening. That's why her story is resurfacing now, not by accident but by necessity. Because the same darkness that consumed her era has ripened again in ours, disguised in algorithms, economies, and ideologies. You can feel it. The tightening, the fatigue, the quiet rage at systems that pretend to protect you while draining your life from the inside. That's the new auction house. That's the same ledger. Only this time, you have the chance to walk out of it consciously. But here's the truth they never want you to know. The system can control your environment, your choices, your comfort, but not your consciousness. Consciousness cannot be owned. It can only be forgotten. That's what Eliza's scream was, a flash of remembered divinity. A woman, beaten, stripped, broken by commerce, still shouting into the void, "I am not yours." And that sentence, whether whispered or screamed, has always been the beginning of every revolution that mattered. So let me ask you something. When was the last time you said it? When was the last time you looked at something that claimed to own your time, your peace, your attention, and said no? That's how it begins. That's how freedom begins. Eliza's story isn't history, it's a code, and every man who hears it is given a choice. To keep living quietly inside the plantation's illusion, or to wake up and remember that no system, no master, no creed, no power can own what's awake. Her scream is not asking to be pitied, it's asking to be continued. There's a moment, just before a man awakens, when the world he thought he knew begins to crumble. It doesn't. It happens with thunder or revelation. It happens in silence. That's how the truth always arrives, quietly, like a pulse returning to a body thought long dead. Eliza's scream is that pulse. It's the moment before awakening, the tremor before awareness, and if you're still here, still listening, it means that tremor has already begun in you, because this story isn't just about a woman in 1842, it's about the system that shaped you, the one you were born into without consent. It's the reason you feel restless even when you're successful, the reason comfort never satisfies, the reason you sense something hollow beneath all this order. That's not depression, it's recognition. It's your soul realizing that you're living inside a design not meant for your liberation, but for your compliance. The plantation of the 19th century used fences and overseers. The plantation of the 21st uses convenience and comfort. You don't need to be chained when your cage feels luxurious. You don't need to rebel when you believe you're already free. But every illusion has a crack, and Eliza's scream is that crack, an echo that refuses to let the lies stay whole. When Solomon Northup witnessed her pleading for her children, he didn't just see tragedy, he saw the blueprint. He saw how the system worked, not through brute force, but through the manipulation of human emotion. They didn't just break bodies, they redesigned love. They took the most sacred human bond, a mother and her child, and rewired it into weakness. What happens when a scream crosses centuries? When a sound born from agony becomes a vibration that shapes consciousness itself? The answer is written not in history books, but in bloodlines, in instinct, in the quiet rebellions of the human soul. Because a scream, once heard, never truly disappears, it becomes a signal. A call to every generation that lives inside systems pretending to be moral. And if you are still here listening, then that signal has found you. You see, Eliza's cry didn't die in that room, it multiplied. It entered the architecture of time itself. It became part of the collective DNA of defiance that every man feels when he senses injustice but cannot explain why. It became the tremor you feel when you watch cruelty and something ancient inside you refuses to accept it. It's not just empathy, it's memory. The memory of being human before obedience became a virtue. That's what the masters feared most, that the enslaved would remember who they truly were. That's why they outlawed education. That's why they separated families. That's why they crushed every act of love that rose above fear. Because love, in its pure form, is the end of hierarchy. Eliza's scream wasn't just love. It was love unleashed, the kind that doesn't care about order, law, or logic, the kind that collapses empires when it's remembered. But that's the paradox of civilization. It promises order, yet it thrives on chaos, the chaos it hides from you. Behind every polished institution lies a core of calculated violence. Behind every polished phrase, stability, security, growth. There's the same brutal equation that once sold a mother for profit. They call it progress. But progress that depends on forgetting isn't evolution, it's decay with better branding. The same psychology that tore Eliza's family apart still rules boardrooms, governments, and media studios today. It's the psychology of ownership, the belief that everything and everyone must serve the few, that human life is currency, that emotion is inefficiency, that compassion must be regulated, and truth must be packaged. This is why modern society feels sterile, because the human element has been stripped out of it. Every interaction is mediated, every thought monetized, every act of creation turned into a metric. You no longer live in a civilization. You live in a simulation maintained by invisible overseers who study your behavior and feed it back to you as convenience. The same plantation logic, optimize the body, extract its value, control its reproduction, has evolved into the data economy. You are still on the auction block. You are just being sold differently now. Eliza's tears became collateral for credit. Yours become data for algorithms. Her scream was silenced by force. Yours is silenced by noise. The only difference is that you think you're free, and that's the final trick of the modern overseer, to make the slave love the system. When Eliza realized she was being separated from her children, she did something unthinkable. She screamed in defiance of God and man. She broke the etiquette of obedience. She became chaos in a room that demanded composure. That act, small, tragic, human, was actually the beginning of revolution, because she dared to express what everyone else feared to feel. That's what awakening looks like. Not calm enlightenment, not polite understanding, but a rupture. A scream that exposes the world's illusion of order. And the reason her story feels dangerous even now is because it holds a mirror to our own silence. It asks the question we spend our lives avoiding. What have you agreed to that violates your soul? Look around. You see men who feel trapped in lives they didn't choose, women who shrink their light to survive, children raised to perform in the TED of dream. You see nations built on exploitation calling themselves free. You see art turned into advertising, faith turned into branding, truth turned into content. You see the plantation everywhere, but disguised as progress. The modern man no longer kneels before a master, he kneels before metrics. He doesn't hear the whip. He hears the ping of his phone. He doesn't fear punishment. He fears being forgotten. The plantation doesn't need guards anymore. It has your reflection. Because now, you police yourself. You monitor your tone, your thoughts, your emotions to stay acceptable, marketable, employable. You measure your worth by how efficiently you can hide your own truth. That is psychological slavery, the most sophisticated form ever invented. And yet, the system trembles. Because the same energy that lived in Eliza's scream still exists. It never vanished. It only slept. Every time a human being refuses to betray their inner truth for acceptance, it awakens. Every act of creation that isn't profitable, every love that defies logic, every voice that speaks when silence is expected. It's the same rebellion she embodied. This is what the powerful will never understand. You cannot destroy the human spirit. You can only distract it. You cannot erase truth. You can only bury it under noise. But the noise always fails eventually, because one day the silence comes, and in that silence, the scream returns. That moment is coming again. You can feel it in the tension of the world, in the confusion, the division, the exhaustion. The system is cracking. The old gods of money and manipulation are losing their worshippers. People are waking up one by one, not with violence, but with awareness. The kind of awareness that makes lies unsustainable. And when that awareness reaches critical mass, when enough people refuse to be owned, everything changes, not by law, but by frequency. Because the truth doesn't need to conquer, it only needs to be remembered. That's what Eliza's story is. Remembrance, the forbidden kind. The kind that rewrites history from within, the kind that reminds every man that power built on domination is already dying, and if her scream has reached you across time, it's because you are meant to carry it forward, not in pity, not in rage, but in awakening. Her scream is no longer hers, it's ours. It belongs to anyone who has ever looked at the world and whispered, "Something isn't right." And those words, spoken quietly at first, are how every age of control begins to end. They made love dangerous. When the scream becomes a whisper inside the human mind, civilization begins to crack. That's where you stand now, at the edge of two realities. One is the visible world, the system you were trained to trust. The other is the underworld of truth, buried, denied, but alive. Every man who hears that whisper faces a choice. Retreat into comfort or descend into understanding. And if you're still here, still breathing with that unease in your chest, then you've already chosen descent. Let's go deeper. When Solomon Northup wrote about Eliza in 12 Years a Slave, he said her screams haunted him more than the chains. He had seen men beaten, women stripped, bodies branded, but nothing compared to the sound of a mother losing her children. It wasn't the volume of her cry that broke him, it was its purity. It was truth stripped of performance. It was the raw, unfiltered essence of humanity in collision with power. That sound was revelation. And that's why every institution since has tried to control emotion, because emotion reveals truth faster than intellect ever can. Empires survive not by silencing information, but by numbing emotion. They teach you to analyze, not to feel, to observe suffering, not to respond, to intellectualize injustice until compassion becomes optional. That's how they've domesticated the human spirit. Eliza's world was brutal because it was honest about its cruelty. Our world is worse because it disguises its cruelty as virtue. They tell you to stay informed, but they drown you in endless stories of pain until your empathy collapses. They tell you to find balance, but they sell you distractions that keep you spiritually malnourished. They tell you to chase success, but they define success as service to systems that profit from your exhaustion. And all of it is built on the same principle that governed that New Orleans auction room. Keep them productive, keep them divided, keep them silent. You are not living in the future. You are living in an evolved plantation. The crops have changed, but the purpose hasn't. Then it was sugar, cotton, and flesh. Now it's data, attention, and compliance. The same psychology governs both. Dehumanize the laborer, commodify the human, monetize the soul. You've seen it, haven't you? The way the modern world rewards emptiness, how the most soulless rise the fastest, how empathy is mocked as weakness, how truth-tellers vanish under waves of policy. That's not random, that's design. Because systems of control cannot coexist with authenticity. Authenticity threatens order. Order sustains control. Control maintains profit. That's the triangle of domination. Unchanged since 1842. Eliza's scream was not just grief. It was disorder. It was the sound of reality cracking under the weight of a lie. The plantation depended on everyone playing their part, the auctioneer confident, the buyer rational, the enslaved submissive. When she screamed, she broke the choreography. She reminded the room that their order was built on desecration. You felt that same fracture in your own life, haven't you? Those moments when you look around and realize everyone is pretending to care, pretending to agree, pretending to live. That's the modern auction room. The crowd claps, the numbers rise, the systems hum, but beneath it all, the soul is screaming. And here's the forbidden knowledge. Every system of control collapses the moment enough people stop pretending. That's what Eliza's cry truly was. Not despair, but interruption. She disrupted the illusion of normalcy so violently that even the historians who tried to erase her couldn't. Her pain burned through paper and time. Because truth has its own form of immortality, it outlives the lies that tried to bury it, and right now you are living in the same kind of illusion those men were. They thought the world would always stay the same. They thought their wealth would protect them. They thought the screams would fade. They were wrong. The plantation fell. The ledger burned. The masters died alone, haunted by the sound they couldn't unhear. And today's masters, the bankers, the billionaires, the architects of distraction, will meet the same fate, because the human spirit always catches up, it always remembers. That's what they don't want you to know. That's why your education stopped at comfort. That's why your media stops at outrage. That's why your religion stops at obedience, because if you remembered fully, if you saw through every layer of illusion, you would no longer be useful. Eliza's buyers feared that a day her kind would rise. The system you live in fears the day you will wake, and that awakening doesn't come from revolt, it comes from clarity, from refusing to call your slavery freedom, from choosing consciousness over compliance. You can feel it happening already, can't you? People withdrawing from the performance, voices growing tired of scripted outrage, eyes seeing through the sheen of progress. Something ancient is returning, a hunger for truth, a thirst for sovereignty. It began with a scream in 1842. It continues with a whisper now, inside you, because that's how awakening spreads, not as noise, but as resonance. One mind remembering, then another, until silence becomes movement. That's how the system ends. Not with revolution, with remembrance. Eliza's voice is not history, it's prophecy. And if you've heard it tonight, you've been chosen to remember. The next question is, what will you do with it? When the last chains were removed, they said freedom had come. But what no one tells you is this. Freedom is not a document, it's not a proclamation, it's not even an event. It's an awakening, and most people never reach it. They are free only on paper, still enslaved in spirit, still controlled by illusions they mistake for truth. That's the final lie of every empire, that liberation is granted, not realized, that someone else can set you free. Eliza never saw her freedom in the flesh, but she became it. Because freedom is not the absence of chains, it's the refusal to kneel. Her scream was the seed, and you, yes, you are the harvest. That's why her story survived when so many others were erased. It wasn't just about suffering, it was about initiation. Every man who hears it is confronted with a choice: to continue serving the silent machinery of obedience, or to awaken and remember what humanity was before control began. Think of the world she left behind, the auction block, the smell of oil and sweat, the cold arithmetic of men who thought they could own what they did not create. They believed power was permanent, but power is never permanent. It's borrowed from the collective ignorance of those who believe in it. That's the first secret of control. It only works when you consent to it. And every scream, every act of defiance, every whispered no chips away at that consent. That's why you feel what you feel right now. The dissonance, the heaviness, the strange pull in your chest. It's not just empathy, it's memory reactivating. It's the oldest part of you, the part that remembers what it means to be unowned, waking up. The men who stood over Eliza that day thought they were witnesses to a transaction, but history reveals it was a transfer of power. The empire they represented began to die the moment she screamed, because domination cannot survive the sound of its own lie being exposed, and that's what's happening again now. The plantation has expanded, yes, but its foundations are cracking. The overseers are losing their script. The algorithms are breaking under the weight of human unpredictability. The very systems designed to control you are beginning to feed you truth, because the truth now travels faster than censorship. The machine is glitching, and you are the glitch. Do you understand what that means? You are living at the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. The world you were born into, built on control, hierarchy, manipulation, is losing coherence. It cannot survive awareness, and awareness is spreading like wildfire. That's why this moment feels chaotic. That's why everything seems to be collapsing. It's not destruction, it's exorcism. The scream is back, not as agony, but as consciousness. Every man who refuses to trade his integrity for approval continues Eliza's scream. Every woman who reclaims her worth in a world that profits from her silence carries her power. Every soul that remembers truth is the undoing of empire. You've been told to be calm, to stay small, to blend in, to call this collapse a crisis. But what you're witnessing is not the end of the world, it's the end of a lie, and you have a role. You are not here just to learn history, you are here to embody it, to become the correction, the living proof that consciousness cannot be enslaved forever. When Eliza screamed, she wasn't asking for rescue, she was sounding the alarm for generations unborn. She was speaking across centuries to you. She was saying, remember what they did and never let it happen again, not in flesh, not in spirit, not in thought. Her voice was not an echo of despair, it was an initiation into sight, into seeing the mechanism behind the illusion, into recognizing that every institution that demands your silence is just a modern version of that auction room. The faces have changed, the rituals have evolved, but the structure remains, until you refuse it. That's the moment power breaks, when even one human being stops participating, because control requires belief, and the instant you stop believing in your own inferiority, the structure starts to rot. That's the truth they feared. That's why they erased her name, because they knew if even one person remembered her story in full, not as tragedy but as revelation, the spell would begin to unravel. So let's break it completely. Right now, wherever you are, say her name aloud. Whisper it if you must, but let the air carry it. Eliza, you have just done what the system feared most. You have remembered what they tried to erase. You've resurrected a frequency older than empire, stronger than hierarchy, more contagious than fear. That's what the scream has become, a current that runs through time, waiting for voices like yours to join it. You see, awakening doesn't happen in noise. It happens in silence, when the heart stops pretending. It happens when you realize that everything you've been told about power is upside down. The slave who remembers truth is freer than the master who lives by lies. That's the final reversal. That's the forbidden knowledge. The real power has never belonged to those who rule. It has always belonged to those who remember. So as this story closes, understand this. You were never meant to watch it. You were meant to continue it. Because history is not behind you. It's beneath you, pulsing, waiting to be reborn through you. When you step outside tonight, when the air feels still and heavy, listen closely. That sound you'll hear in the distance, soft, almost imperceptible, isn't the wind. It's her voice, the one that refuses to die. It's the sound of the human spirit reminding itself, I will not be owned. Say it twice, and let the chain fall. Attachment became vulnerability, compassion became liability. That's how domination sustains itself. It teaches you to distrust what makes you human, and that's what they've done to you. You were born into a structure that mocks empathy as naivety, dismisses truth as extremism, and rewards self-betrayal as professionalism. You were taught that obedience is maturity and that rebellion is chaos. That's how control is internalized, by convincing the prisoner that his cell is wisdom. Eliza's overseer told her, compose yourself. That command still exists today, whispered through every institution that fears emotion. Stay composed. Stay polite. Don't raise your voice. Don't disrupt. Don't feel too much, because emotion is rebellion. Emotion threatens the order of control. They understood something dark. Emotion is energy. It's power. And if people are allowed to feel fully, they begin to act. The plantation owners knew that tears, if left unchecked, could become fire. So they trained the enslaved to suppress even their pain. The modern system does the same. It rewards stoicism while quietly feeding off suppressed rage. You feel that, don't you? That weight in your chest. The anger that never gets released, the sorrow you never talk about, the exhaustion you carry like armor. It's not just personal, it's systemic, it's generational. It's the residue of centuries of conditioning designed to make you manageable. The men who once traded Eliza's body now trade your attention. Both transactions depend on one thing, your disconnection from self. If you're cut off from your own emotions, you're easier to steer. You'll consume more, fear more, obey more. That's why the system fears art, philosophy, faith in its purest form, anything that reconnects you to the infinite, because connection is the death of control. Eliza's cry wasn't just sound, it was connection. It shattered the illusion that the auction room was a place of order. It reminded everyone that chaos, truth, still lived beneath the system's perfection. That's why even the traders fell silent for a moment, because when a human being screams in the face of power, something sacred wakes up in everyone who hears it. And maybe that's happening to you now. Maybe you can feel it, some part of you that refuses to bow. The world will call that defiance, dangerous, irresponsible, even insane. They'll tell you to calm down, to move on, to be realistic. But remember, every empire's greatest fear is a man who refuses to move on, because a man who refuses to forget cannot be controlled. Eliza's buyers lived their lives believing they had succeeded. They died rich, respected, buried under marble. But their names mean nothing now. They were forgotten because they stood on the wrong side of truth. Eliza's name, erased from the record, lives forever because truth has no expiration date. And that's the paradox. The oppressors vanish. The oppressed become immortal. The ledgers decay, but the scream endures. Every tyrant becomes a ghost. Every witness becomes the soil of awakening. That's why this story still exists. It's not about guilt. It's about memory. It's about restoring the knowledge that was deliberately buried, that the most powerful force on earth isn't wealth or order or law. It's the human capacity to remember what was taken and reclaim what cannot be owned. When Eliza screamed, she wasn't just begging for her children. She was declaring a law older than any constitution. You cannot own what comes from God. And that is what made her dangerous. Not her beauty, Not her tears, her understanding. Every system of control fears the same thing, that its subjects will begin to see themselves not as victims of fate, but as custodians of truth. Because once that realization ignites, compliance dies. The plantation collapses, the overseer loses meaning, and that's why stories like this are called dark history, not because they are evil, but because they reveal how evil hides in light. Eliza's scream isn't darkness, it's the sound of dawn. It's the light breaking through the structure of lies. The men who stood in that auction pen thought they were witnessing a sale, but history remembers it as a revelation, the moment when the myth of civilization cracked open and showed its true face. And that's what's happening again today. You can feel it. Governments trembling, systems collapsing, truth breaking through propaganda. Every structure of power that built itself on silence is shaking. You are living in the same kind of moment that Eliza created. A reckoning. The question is, will you silence it or continue it? If her scream reached across centuries to find you, it wasn't for pity, it was for participation. Because awakening isn't inherited, it's chosen. You choose it every time you remember, every time you resist the pressure to normalize the inhuman, every time you say no. The same energy that once shook the walls of that New Orleans auction room is still here, waiting for someone who dares to use it.